So what we're going to be looking at over the course of the hour and a half that we have together are some of these objectives. We're going to define COVID-19 and review how to protect ourselves and others. We'll go over some best practices and things like that, generally what workplaces should be doing. We'll look at the employer's responsibilities regarding pandemics by reviewing the Canada Labour Code and references to provincial legislations. In the Prairie Region, we have people that fall under the federal jurisdiction, but we also have members that fall under provincial legislation, both in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. So we want to make sure that the information that we're relaying represents all our members. So as we go through this webinar, the process that I've kind of worked out is we'll go through the federal code and then make references and clarifications to the provincial legislations. So as we go along, we'll review the federal, and then along each step along the way, I'll provide references and comments on the two provincial legislations that are covered in the Prairie Region. Alberta, we don't have any provincially legislated members, so we're going to leave them out of the discussion for our purposes today. We're also going to identify the rights and responsibilities of employees with regards to required training, information, precautions, and protective equipment. One of the key issues that's been keeping me really hopping the past week or two is some of the questions around the lack of training in workplaces, the lack of information being conveyed by the employer, and some of those precautions that are being put in place that don't go nearly far enough, and people aren't receiving training on how to deal with those precautions and personal protective equipment. So we'll talk about some of that type of stuff this evening as well. We want to identify supports and redress mechanisms if experiencing workplace issues, including enacting the right to refuse dangerous work. There's the ability for all legislations to take that into consideration. And as we go into it, I'll explain a little bit more, but that's the best tool we have for holding the employer accountable immediately and protecting each and every worker in that workplace. So we'll explore some of the options around that. And then what we'll do is after the presentation, we'll have an opportunity to address some frequently asked questions. And then I've got a couple slides that highlight some of the key concerns that have been brought forward to me that I think are worthwhile to discuss in this forum. So with that, we have a couple people on the call that I'd like to introduce. First one on our list is Lindsay Sparks. He's the regional representative that used to be out of the Winnipeg regional office, but will be moving to the Calgary regional office. He'll be monitoring the questions. So once the presentation's over, he'll ask the questions, and then I'll do my best to answer them. We also have Alana Mackinson on the line, who is the Prairie Region, the PSAC Prairie Region Political Communications Officer. So she's been newly hired to the position. So she'll be using this opportunity to gather information and learn about this whole webinar process on how it works. And most importantly, outside of myself, is Marianne Ledoux. She's the Regional Executive Vice President for the Prairie Region, and she's the senior elected official within the PSAC in the Prairie Region. There's been a lot going on around mobilization, around information sharing at a national level on this subject of the pandemic. So I'll open up the opportunity for Marianne to share her opening comments. And Marianne, you have to unmute yourself.
Perfect.
There you go.
There we go. Perfect. Thank you. It's been a while since I've been on a webinar. So first of all, I want to thank Clint for pulling this together. He's always been really proactive on health and safety, and because of the geography that we have, it's a really good tool to be able to reach our members throughout the 3 provinces. So I don't think that this was a surprise to anyone. However, it has been a scenario that changes every day, every hour, and we are doing everything we can to stay on top of this. First and foremost, to all of our frontline workers, I want to say thank you. Canadians are depending on you to do the work that you've done every day without notice, and so I know that you're going to work, you're doing work from home, and I just want to make sure that you recognize while you are, you're there for Canadians, you also need to take care of yourself. You can do no one any good if yourself gets infected or your family. So thank you for the work that you're doing throughout, the region, from every corner and every community. So just a few things as this was developing, the National Board of Directors, which is all 7 of the regional executive vice presidents, the national president, national executive vice president, and all component presidents have had many, many conference calls on this. We are being updated usually every couple of days. But Chris Elward, the national president, is also forwarding information to the entire National Board of Directors as quickly as he receives it. He is having conference calls with Treasury Board basically daily to get updates on what is happening and when we are seeing systemic problems in departments that are not following the guidelines that nationally they're asking people to do. He is working with the components and he is raising that at the table directly with Treasury Board. So realistically, the components, for those of you that belong to a component, that's going to be your front line. So your local, your regional vice president, your national vice president, the structures are a bit different. They're the ones having discussions with departments directly when there are problems, and we're trying to resolve as many problems in that way as possible. If that's not possible, then Chris is absolutely taking them to Treasury Board, and in many cases, we're getting that resolved. Just from PSAC's perspective, we are, as Clint mentioned, he is a staff person, we are an employer. And so we have a responsibility to all of our staff from coast to coast to coast. So all PSAC offices are officially closed. All of our staff is continuing to work. They are working from home, they are teleworking. All of the phone systems are being answered. So if you do need to reach someone, you can still phone your regional office and the phones are being answered and the emails are being answered. You just can't go to the door. We are respecting the no gathering. So in addition to closing the offices, we have suspended all strike votes, including CRA votes that were in the process, and suspended all Treasury Board votes. For those bargaining units that might be ratifying an agreement that are not Treasury Board, that are not federal government, we are looking at other ways to do that by electronic means, mail-in ballot, to be able to get that done. So we're looking at as many alternate ways as possible to do that. All regional conventions have been postponed. No further information on that. So anyone that was a delegate to the Prairies Convention in June, it has been postponed and honestly not a high priority right now. So we will figure it out later on. But for right now, our priority is to make sure that members in the workplace or members working from home have the protections they need. And so we're also working with our locals that, if you're not federal government, in most instances, you're entitled to 699 leave, which means you're entitled to pay. Unfortunately, that's not the reality for all of our members. We are starting to see layoffs. We are fighting tooth and nail for our members that are from provincial jurisdiction or the private sector, that they themselves are seeing themselves laid off. And so we're working closely with those employers trying to ensure that they get some wage continuity. I would ask you to stay on top of the national website. I'm sure Clint will probably mention this at some point. We have a COVID-19 page on the national website. that has all the updated information as things is developing. As we clarify things with Treasury Board, it's all being posted there. We are sharing everything on the Prairie's Facebook page, Prairie's Twitter, Instagram. We're utilizing every tool possible, including, as Clint said, we'll be recording this and sending this out as well. One thing that just developed this afternoon that I will mention is that there's been some changes to the public service healthcare plan. And I would invite you to go either to the Treasury Board page, should be posted on PSAC shortly, but they have extended the the travel insurance to 60 days if you left before March 17th. And if you did, once the 60 days is exceeded, you're done. And they're also allowing for earlier dispensing. So if you want to fill prescriptions sooner, they can do that. And there was a few other things in there. So all of those things are things that we're posting. That's all of the things that we're working on. And, you know, at the end of the day, all I can say to you is for those where it is possible, stay home. You know, it's not very often you're going to hear me quoting the Prime Minister. Usually it's the exact opposite. But this is something that we need to do. And so if you are able, stay home. If you need to go to work, when you come home, you know, stay home. Heed the social distancing, heed the no gatherings. This is absolutely critical because no one is immune to this. And our biggest success after this is all over is to ensure that we don't lose any members to this. We know that some of our members have contracted it, and you know, we will be there to support them. So for all of you on the front line, stay safe. For everyone else, stay safe as well.
Okay, thanks, Marianne. And just to be clear on our webinar this evening, although there is all sorts of issues going around around this pandemic, what we're going to focus in on for this webinar and our purposes in discussion is the health and safety aspects. So, you know, what the legislation says, what our rights are, what we can hold the employer accountable to do, those kinds of things. Oops, sorry. So looking specifically at COVID-19 and how it's defined. So I just wanted to do one little slide on you know, some of the very introductory topics. Lots of information going out there about the coronavirus and what's a novel coronavirus, all those kinds of things. So this slide just kind of outlines that. Coronaviruses, large family of viruses, and they're pretty common, usually with mild illnesses similar to the common cold. A novel coronavirus is a new strain that hasn't previously been identified with humans. And then there's been a couple examples there of examples of where there has been outbreaks. And then even just looking at the timelines, the case was reported December 31st, and confirmation, you know, of the coronavirus was on January 7th, and we're into nearing the end of March, and we're already, you know, seeing numbers way beyond that. So it's a very fast-moving, very aggressive virus that tends to stick on surfaces and things like that a lot longer, and then have a lot greater effect on people, particularly with compromised immune systems. On how the virus is spread, it caused through infections of the nose. It causes infections of the nose, throat, and lungs. Most commonly spread from an infected person through respiratory droplets generated when you cough or sneeze. Close prolonged personal contact, such as touching our hands, shaking hands, touching something with the virus on it, then touching your mouth, eyes, or nose before you're washing your hands. And the current evidence suggests that with this virus in particular, person-to-person spread is efficient when there's close contact. So what I really want to focus in on is some of the tips here, and I'll kind of go into a little more detail about things that you can do yourself to protect to protect yourself and others in the workplace or at home as well. Just general a good guide to use. First one is wash your hands, and I capitalize properly. Really important to wash your hands. That's the best way to protect yourself, is to wash your hands. Hand sanitizers are good, but they're less effective than actually washing your hands. My minimum recommended time for washing your hands is 30 seconds. For those of you that know me, I worked in central sterilization in a hospital for about 16 years before taking on this position, so very acutely aware of the importance of washing hands and doing it properly. So when you're washing your hands, there's lots of good videos out there. If you search it on YouTube, the best one I found is from the World Health Organization. It's about a minute video on how to properly wash your hands, and it looks like you're a surgeon. Some of the key aspects are you want to clean all the crevices in your hands, the cracks on your palms and in through your fingers, webbing, backs of hands, cuticles, all those kinds of things. It's not just a simple process of washing your hands, but you want to make sure that you clean your hands properly so that there's no lingering virus anywhere on your hands. An example of what we used to do in the hospital was, if you ever went to the dentist when you were a kid and they made you chew this purple tablet to see where you didn't brush your teeth very well, we did the same thing with our hands. We'd put a little solution in our hands and it would light up purple to show you where you didn't clean your hands properly. So we want to make sure that we really enforce washing your hands and washing your hands properly. One of the key things you want to do also is avoid touching your face. Our skin, the thick parts of our skin, are really naturally a good deterrent and a good protection against viruses. Where you will see, a very increased risk is where you touch your face where the skin's thin, where the skin is thinner, around your eyes, your nose, those kinds of things. That's really where the virus can attack and gain access to your body. Don't touch anything you don't have to, especially in public. I put this one in for myself. I'm always running my hand along rails, touching things I don't have to, those kinds of things. Just a reminder to be really conscious about, don't really touch anything that you don't have to, especially in public. A good example would be, I had to go to the store the other day and somebody was shopping next to me. Good social distancing and physical distancing, but they were touching everything on the counter and it was driving me nuts. So just a gentle reminder not to, only touch what you have to. Avoid non-essential travel. Lots of really good information and cracking down from the governments on preventing travel, even just between provinces, those kinds of things. I would refer to that, including in that going to the store. There's going to be times that you go to the store and that's, that's going to happen. But at the same time, you want to make sure that you limit the amount of time that you're spending in, that you're self-isolating, that you're limiting all non-essential interactions. What a lot of people have been doing is also self-isolating. The best way to stop the spread of the virus is to, take the break that all of us seem to be doing and not give that virus an opportunity to spread. Cleaning high-touch surfaces frequently. You think of the obvious doorknobs, those kinds of things. Obviously, you want to wipe those down with a Lysol disinfectant spray, fairly often. But you also want to take into consideration other areas that you touch all the time that you might not think of. The most obvious example I give when I talk about that is your belt buckle. If you've ever gone through some advanced screening in the airport and you're wearing a belt, the first thing they do is swab your belt. Why is that? Because nobody ever washes their belt buckles. So make sure, surfaces such as that you don't commonly think of, that you're also wiping down, keeping clean. What you want to do is stop the spread, limit the number of opportunities for exposure for that virus to linger on a surface to be spread and then continue that process. And the whole concept of masks and gloves. See a lot of people out and about in the public are wearing masks and gloves. I'm not crazy about them, and here's why. First of all, masks give you a false sense of security, and the main way that this virus is spread is through contact. Yes, it is airborne, but the chances of catching it airborne are a lot less than the contact surfaces. So the masks give you a false sense of security. I'm wearing a mask, I don't have to wash my hands as much. That is not the case. Also, people don't properly put on and remove those masks, so they open themselves up to exposure through contact with their face. Gloves are the same sort of thing. If you think you're wearing gloves, you're protecting yourself, but what you're not doing is protecting everybody else around you and all those different contact surfaces. So if you're washing your hands frequently, each time you wash your hands, you're stopping that cycle. If you wear gloves for a couple hours, everything you've touched in that couple hour period, can be spreading the virus. So again, you see all sorts of people do it. If you're doing proper hand washing, there's no need for gloves or masks. Unless you're in like a particularly sensitive workplace, those kinds of things, absolutely there's a time and place for that. But out in the public, not so much. And then the thing that's really been in the forefront of the conversation around how to deal with this is the whole concept of social and physical distancing. So, don't need to go through this too much, but specifically in the workplace, you want to look at using telephone, video conferencing, and internet, just like we're doing for this webinar, to convey information and share thoughts. What you also want to do is limit the amount of people that have to use public transportation, and then with the potential for spreading through public transportation. What the issue in a lot of workplaces are right now is how do you deal with that? How do you work in workplaces that can telework, that have the ability to telework, that build places that, or the work that has to be done that isn't conducive to telework, those kinds of things. And then there's the whole concept of people that have been deemed essential, that they need to go into the workplace or critical, but really their job isn't critical. It's they don't have the ability to telework, so the employer says, oh, you're critical, you need to show into work. And then not because it's critical, but because they have nothing else for you to do. So we're going to explore that a little bit later in the slide presentation as well. So looking at switching gears a little bit, what we want to do is break down some of the legislation that supports some of the actions that we want to do. So as I mentioned at the outset, we'll be looking at first the Canada Labour Code stuff, but we'll also be providing references to the provincial legislations where it makes sense to do so. If you have any other questions, if you're provincially legislated, contact your regional office and they'll be able to provide some more clarity as well. So we'll look at sections that involve the processes, required training, protective equipment, and other employer responsibilities. We'll explore the worker's right to refuse dangerous work if they did not agree with the workplace decisions. And this is a basic right enshrined in all legislations. If you're talking health and safety, 3 basic rights. You have the right to know what the hazards are in your workplace, each and every foreseeable hazard. You have the right to participate. You have the right to participate in resolving workplace issues. You have the right to participate on committees or as health and safety representatives. And most importantly, we're going to discuss a little bit, your third right is the right to refuse work that you feel is dangerous. So we'll look at that process in a little more in depth. Looking first at the preventative measures, this is specific to the Canada Labour Code, but is also referenced in the provincial legislations. Preventative measures should first consist of the elimination of hazards, then the reduction of hazards, and finally the provision of personal protective equipment, clothing, devices, or materials, all with the goal of ensuring health and safety of employees. This one I felt was really important to highlight for a number of reasons. Most importantly, what we find often is if there's a pandemic going on, first the employer says, oh, here's some gloves, here's some sanitizing wipes, off you go. That should be the last thing that should be a consideration when you're dealing with issues in the workplace. First thing you want to do is eliminate that hazard altogether. For obvious reasons, each employer is not going to be able to rid themselves of the COVID virus or the hazards around the COVID virus. But then the next step is, if you can't take the virus out of the equation for health and safety, then take the individual out of the equation. So That's when we're talking about the teleworking options. We're talking about removal from the workplace, limiting workplace interactions, those kinds of things. That's what we'll look at we should be looking at the first step for resolving these issues. If we can't do that, then we look at the reduction of hazards, limiting interactions, limiting public contact, those kinds of things. And then as a last resort, if none of those are possible, then we look at the personal protective equipment. The best way I can use to outline the need to look at this way is my predecessor, Bruce Campbell, always used to tell me a story. He worked at Carling O'Keefe Brewery in the 1970s, probably a fabulous job, used to be able to drink on the job, and of course, there was all sorts of health and safety hazards associated with that. So there was a hazard in the workplace where a bottle was jamming on the line, and if that bottle built up enough pressure, it would explode, sending glass everywhere. First thing you want to do in that scenario is eliminate that hazard. Stop that line from jamming. If you stop that line from jamming, you don't have to worry about glass flying. Problem solved. If you can't do that, the next course of action you need to look at is containing the source of that hazard. So in this case, it'd be building a barrier around that area where the bottle would jam and gas flying. Last thing you should consider is that personal protective equipment. In the 1970s, health and safety wasn't what it used to be or what it is now. So the employer decided, oh, we got this glass flying around, let's give everybody safety glasses. And it happened where somebody was walking by the area when a bottle exploded. Their eyes were fine, but their face and neck was all cut up. Highlights the fact that the personal protective equipment is the least desirable way to try and control an issue because it doesn't limit the hazard and does not eliminate the hazard. It just provides some base level individual protections that are not effective, that should only be considered as a last resort. 124. Similar language in provincial language. Every employer shall ensure that the health and safety at work of every person employed by the employer is protected. Here's your mic drop. Nothing else takes away from that. There's your umbrella language that you'll see in all legislations that provide for the protection of employees and provide direction on the employer's responsibility. And then further along, getting into the specific employer responsibilities around health and safety in the workplace. And then you'll see that language without restricting the generality of 124. So that statement is what it is, nothing takes away from that. Every employer shall, that legal language you want to see, shall, in respect of every workplace controlled by the employer, in respect to every work activity carried out by an employee in a workplace that is not controlled by the employer to the extent the employer controls the activity. Basic short answer to that is if the employer controls it, they have a responsibility to deal with it. Some of the more specific responsibilities provide prescribed sanitary and personal facilities. So they need to provide, clean working space. That's a basic right. Provide every person granted access to the workplace by the employer with prescribed safety materials, equipment, devices, and clothing. So they're responsible for everybody that has access to the workplace. Key one here is the concept of ventilation. What I suggest is workplaces and workplace committees evaluate their ventilation system to make sure it's up to date and up to snuff to ensure that it is adequate with the new challenges that are being presented to us around the virus. Provide in the prescribed manner each employee with the information, instruction, and training and supervision necessary to ensure their health and safety at work. This is a big one, reoccurring in a number of workplaces, is the lack of training that people are given, specifically in their day-to-day work, the health and safety aspects, but also in light of the pandemic. What's the new reality of our workplaces? If you're being provided equipment, what kind of training have you had to use gloves, put masks on and off, how to handle materials, how to properly disinfect surfaces, those kinds of things. That training is really lacking in a lot of our workplaces, in my opinion. Ensure that each employee is made aware of every known or foreseeable health and safety hazard in the area where the employee works. I've heard from a number of employers that this virus, we never saw it coming. absolutely this type of outbreak was absolutely foreseeable. So when we talk about foreseeable, this is absolutely foreseeable, and there was the opportunity to plan for it. A number of different outbreaks, in the past that we could have seen something like this coming again, and then to the extent that it is as well. The employer should have had a plan in place, and then when this outbreak occurred, or this pandemic occurred, they could simply roll out their policy and ensure that it updated where it needed to be, those kinds of things. Well, not a lot of workplaces did that, unfortunately. Ensure that the activities every person granted access to the workplace do not endanger the health and safety of employees. Anybody coming into the building, public, delivery people, contractors, those kinds of things, the employer has a responsibility to ensure that they aren't endangering your health and safety as an employee in that workplace. Ensure that employees who have supervisory and managerial responsibilities are adequately trained in health and safety and informed of the responsibilities they have under this part on where they act on behalf of the employer. So if you imagine how much training employees are getting, be honest with me, how many of you read this one and laughed out loud? How many people have supervisors or managers that have no understanding of their roles and responsibilities under the legislation, and have no training on how to deal with these people, how to deal with the employees, and how to take into consideration the code or the different pieces of legislation? Really another lack in training on all levels that I think is really being highlighted in light of this pandemic. So when we looked at those pieces of legislation, some of the common wording you'll see is prescribed manner, prescribed training, those kinds of things. Where do you define what is prescribed? There's a couple different ways that you can do that. First one is through different pieces of legislation that support what's in either the federal code or the provincial acts through the regulations. Different workplaces also have different jurisdictions. In the federal public service, your workplace might fall under the National Joint Council Occupational Health and Safety Directives. There provides some clarification on what prescribed is for each of those sections. And if it's not clear or clearly defined in the regulations or in some of those other directives, one of the key aspects is the workplace policy committees and workplace representatives are able to define what is prescribed training, what is prescribed precautions, those kinds of things. When we look at health and safety issues in the workplace, what I found, unfortunately, is even if workplaces are active, workplace committees and policy committees are active, they don't get the training that are needed to have in order to fulfill their duties. So when instances come up like this, workplace committee members and health and safety representatives don't have the training they need to spot the hazards, to evaluate policies, those kinds of things. One note on this slide, provincially, there is no reference to policy committees. That's specifically to federal language. But both federal and provincial language refer to health and workplace committee or health and safety representative. Only real difference there is the size of the workplace. Workplace of over 20 people is required to have a committee. If there's less than 20 people in that workplace, then they're required to have a health and safety representative. Exact same roles and responsibilities, just based on this difference in the size of the workplace. Some of the wording specific to the committees and representatives and their role in addressing some of these workplace issues. So the employer is responsible or is required to consult with the policy committee or the workplace committee or the health and safety representative to plan the implementation of changes that might affect occupational health and safety. So it might not affect health and safety, but the word there is might. If it might, then that's the starting point for the committees to be involved in being part of the decision-making process, to be consulted, to participate in the actions of the workplace. Next one, consult with the workplace committee or health and safety representative in the implementation of changes that might affect health and safety. So the workplace committee or the workplace health and safety representative, they need to be consulted in the implementation of the changes. So it's not a situation where the employer says, okay, this is what we're doing. We didn't consult with the committee. We didn't talk to anybody. We just decided to go ahead. That's not how that should work. If you're looking for the specific provincial equivalents, there's the two sections for both Manitoba and Saskatchewan on those sections that we reviewed in the federal legislation. What I specifically want to look at is the right to refuse dangerous work. So not my first option for resolving issues, to be honest, but given some of the challenges that that our workers are facing, this is the process that I'm recommending workers follow if there's discrepancies between what they believe to be safe working conditions and what the employer is saying that they're safe working conditions. Especially given the heightened sensitivity and the threats, hazards associated with this pandemic. It's raised a lot of questions, and it's also made necessary quick action. So the best way to get quick action and quick responses is the right to refuse. And it's one of my preferred ways to resolve this for a couple different reasons. One is it protects that worker immediately. The employee says, I'm not doing this work. They're removing themselves from the situation, and they don't go back in until they feel it's safe to do so, or they get a decision from a health and safety officer saying otherwise. It also provides protection for income. So if somebody enacts their right to refuse, they're still guaranteed to be paid during that process. And it also provides protections against discipline. So if somebody is reasonable in enacting their right to refuse, they cannot be disciplined, they cannot be treated differently because they are using their rights allotted to them. So for those reasons, the right to refuse is my preferred method at this point for resolving issues. If it was a different set of circumstances, there's other processes that aren't as aggressive, but given the circumstances, this is the best way to go in my opinion. So again, starting off looking at the federal language, federal definition of danger, any hazard, condition, or activity that could be reasonably expected to be an imminent or a serious threat to the life of a person exposed to it before the hazard or condition can be corrected or the activity altered. So when we're looking at this language absolutely sucks. Thanks to Stephen Harper a number of years ago changing this definition. The old definition and the provincial definitions refer to potential or foreseeable instances. Federal language refers to imminent or serious threat. So when you're looking at potential hazards, addressing concerns before they become imminent, this language is not supportive of that. Check with your PSAC regional office for provincial definitions of danger. Don't worry about it, we're going there next. Looking at the provincial language for Manitoba, there's your section there that refers to the starting point for the right to refuse. A worker may refuse to work or do particular work at a workplace if he or she believes on reasonable grounds that the work constitutes a danger to his or her safety or health or to the health and safety of another worker or another person. So a little bit different starting period. If you reasonably think that you're in danger, there's not a clear specific definition in the provincial language in Manitoba around danger, but if it's reasonable that you feel there's a danger, that's your starting point to consider. Looking at the Saskatchewan provincial language, very similar language. Worker may refuse to perform any particular act or series of acts at a place of employment if the worker has reasonable grounds to believe that the act or series of acts is unusually dangerous to the worker's health or safety or the health or safety of any other person at the place of employment. And then there's the two steps there. Sufficient steps have been taken or the committee has investigated and advised the worker otherwise. So the right to refuse would stop in the Saskatchewan provincial language once the committee has investigated and made a determination. you can still carry that forward. The right to refuse stops in Saskatchewan after the committee has made their investigation, which really supports the need to have strong, well-informed, well-trained committee members representing our workers in the workplace on those committees, because they play a large active role in determining the health and safety of the workplace. We'll look through the steps in the federal language before we do a little breakdown on the provincial language. Pretty straightforward process, pretty well outlined. The employee refuses, lets the employer know. The employer investigates and decides what they're going to do, has to respond in writing. If the employer is happy, goes back to work. If the employee is not satisfied, it's probably the way it's going to go. The employee lets the committee know. The committee, usually one employee representative, one employer representative on that committee, do investigation and make their recommendations to the employer. If the employee is satisfied again with the committee's report and the actions taken, then they return to work and the right to refuse ends. Next point here is specific to the federal language. You won't see any reference to it in the provincial languages, and it's another, Stephen Harper legacy change to the Health and Safety Code. So after the Health and Safety Committee makes their recommendations, the employer gets to go back and say, hey, reconsider your decision. Why that process is there when the employer already provides their information before the committee determines. I kind of view that as an opportunity for the employer to influence the decision of the committee, and I don't like it. A revised report if deemed appropriate. So the committee can revise the report based on the additional information from the employer. The employer then gets to decide whether a danger exists. If that danger does exist, then they outline the corrections that need to be taken. And then there's two reasons why somebody cannot enact the right to refuse. So even though if there's a danger, first one is if it puts the health and safety of somebody else in danger. A good example would that be corrections. You work with a partner, you can't refuse work, and it puts your partner at risk by leaving them alone. And the other proviso is it's a normal condition of employment. In that same example, as a corrections officer, there's all sorts of hazards in the workplace that are absolutely dangerous, but it's a normal part of what you do in most circumstances. So then it would not be, you would not be able to refuse that work. If the employee still does not agree with the decision of the employer after that, then they can send it to the Minister of Labor or by in effect to a health and safety officer to make their determination. And that process of the right to refuse continues through that. Quickly breaking down the Saskatchewan and Manitoba references. Sometimes it's helpful even looking at other jurisdictions and other pieces of legislation, because it helps provide some insight and some direction onto some of the intent around the language as well. So generally speaking, employee wishes to exercise the right to refuse, tells the employer of the dangerous situation. In provincial legislation, there's a reference to group complaints. So if there's a bunch of people with the same complaint, they can each file their own complaint. And if they feel it's best to lump them all together, they can do that. One of the key aspects that we look at when we do the right to refuse is it's different than the grievance process within a collective agreement. So if the employer provides direction around a collective agreement, then what you would do is you would follow the employer's directions, so you aren't insubordinate, and then you grieve it after the fact. This whole right to refuse process is different than that. If the employer says you must do this, you have the ability to say, no, I am not doing that action. I think it's dangerous to my health. I'm not going to do that. So you have the ability to put your foot down and put an immediate stop-o to the activity and the threat to your health and safety. So the same sort of process, the employee has exercised the right to refuse. The employer investigates, makes a decision. They can do that without the employee being present if it's not applicable. Those kinds of things are not able to. Specific in the language as well is the employer can't assign somebody else to do the work that the employee has refused to do. So if somebody else has done the right to refusal, nobody else can be put in that dangerous situation until the issue is resolved, which is really important to take into consideration when, especially when you're dealing with multiple employees in the same workplace. So again, the employer provides a written report. If the employer agrees with the recommendations, it stops. And if the employer also needs to let the committee know, this is what happened and this is what we did to resolve it. Again, employee, if they don't agree with the employer, which my guess is going to be the majority of the cases, the employee can continue their refusal. And then that decision goes to the committee or the representative. And same sort of process. The committee appoints 2 members to conduct the investigation, 1 employee representative, 1 employer representative, and they make a recommendation to the employer to resolve the issue. Once the employer has gotten the recommendation from the committee, they can make those same decisions as before. Either there is a danger, this is what we're going to do about it, or yes, there is a danger, but it falls within the categories of normal conditions of employment. We aren't going to do anything about it, or there's no danger. And if the employee does not agree with that recommendation, then they get to take it to a health and safety officer. And then there's just another slide reinforcing what I've already said around the concept of inherent risk. So, if there's the concept of inherent risk, the employer has to notify the employee in writing that, yes, there is a risk, but we think it's a normal condition of employment, or it puts somebody else in danger by doing that. And again, if the employee disagrees, then it goes to a health and safety officer provincially, or federally, the Minister of Labor, which is a health and safety officer at ESDC, and they can do an investigation to determine. And the health and safety officer can either make recommendations for the employer to follow, or they can provide an order saying within 30 days the employer must blah blah blah. Once it gets to the health and safety officer, it's out of the employer's decision what they will do. They have to follow the direction of the health and safety officer. At that point, their decision-making process is over. They need to follow what the health and safety officer has dictated, either by recommendation or by order. And then the health and safety officer makes the same determinations that the employer had. Now, is it a danger? Is it not a danger? Or is there no right to refuse? One of the key sections I'd like to highlight when we're around this, heard from a number of different workplaces, is they need to take action in the workplace, but the employers threaten them with discipline or other action if they decide to do that. So here's your federal language. No employer shall dismiss, suspend, lay off, or demote an employee, impose a financial or other penalty on an employee, or refuse to pay an employee, or take any disciplinary action against, or threaten to take such action against an employee because the employee has acted in accordance with this part. So they can't discipline you and they can't threaten to discipline you for enacting your rights, assuming you're doing that in a reasonable manner. And then at the end of below that slide is the 2 references to both the Saskatchewan and Manitoba sections that refer to disciplinary action, preventing the employer from taking disciplinary action against an employee who has enacted the right to refuse, or any of the other parts of the Act or the Code. Workplaces should have an infection control plan, should have already been in place, just a matter of rolling it out for when this hit. My guess is a number of workplaces hadn't. If there's a situation where people need to go into work, they need to provide clean hand washing facilities, offer alcohol-based hand sanitizers when regular facilities are not available or not sufficient. There needs to be additional cleaning in all workplaces around, especially objects and surfaces that are touched frequently. And then there's a number of examples there. Making sure the ventilation systems are working properly. Every workplace should be doing that, especially in light of the pandemic and and the risks associated with airborne viruses. Providing for personal protective equipment when there's no other options, and most importantly, provide proper training on the hazards and proper protection techniques. As we know, and as we outlined, the employer has a responsibility to train and make each and every employee aware of every foreseeable and potential hazard in the workplace. So we really need to hold the employer accountable in aspect of the training that they need to offer each and every employee in the workplace. One of the questions that has been, I've been receiving a lot lately is the whole concept of people that have been deemed essential or critical in the workplace. And as I mentioned at the outset, there's been a number of instances where people have been determined to be critical or essential, not because they are in fact essential or critical, but the fact that they have no ability to do their work remotely, those kinds of things. So then the employer has basically said, you're critical because we have nothing else for you. And that's not the case. So below, I've done a quick copy and paste from the Treasury Board, even though this is for the Treasury Board. I think this is good guidance for all workplaces to consider when they look at the options of teleworking, because teleworking and getting people removed from the workplace is the first and best option for protecting people. And we need to keep that in consideration. So from the Treasury Board, managers are to consider telework for all employees at all work sites and identify an approach that is flexible while ensuring continued critical government operations and services to Canadians. Federal organizations must identify and determine how to manage through exceptional situations that do not lend themselves to telework, such as critical services requiring on-site presence, security limitations, other operational imperatives where there are no alternatives. So there's a number of things that each and every workplace should take into consideration when they're looking at options for teleworking, removing people from the workplace, working remotely, limiting workplace interactions, those kinds of things. And again, if there's any disputes with the employer and their decision, my first suggestion is to bring them forward and discuss them specifically with the employer. And if they don't do that, then your best option is to refuse that work if you feel your health and safety is at danger. Some suggestions for people that are currently teleworking. There's a lot of people in the workplace right now that don't normally telework, and all of a sudden they're teleworking. So I want to make sure that we cover off some of the, the scenarios around teleworking. So if you're teleworking, you want to make sure you have a space or room that is easy to concentrate. We'll talk a little bit about mental health and how that's playing into everything going on as well. Level of security as required by the workplace. People that often telework, they do workplace inspections, direction to keep your doors locked, all those kinds of things. So some of the same security measures that would be in the workplace, we need to make sure that they're at the telework location as well. And around the big one, especially with teleworking, is making sure that you have an ergonomically sound and safe workplace. So if there's equipment that you need while you're at working teleworking in order to do your job safely, that needs to be provided as well. So it's not just, here's a laptop, off you go kind of thing. There needs to be a process to ensure that while you're teleworking, you're able to do that safely. Questions around mental health. Some of the things I'd like to highlight around that are first point around understanding the fight or flight response. A lot of that has to do with the anxiety that many people are feeling around all the the changes. They seem to be changing hourly in some cases, some of the practices, those kinds of things. And that's our sort of protection system kicking in. Apprehensive and anxious about what's coming up, where the threats are, those kinds of things. So we need to be understanding that, there's a lot of anxiety kicking up around those kinds of things. One of the things I always really want to highlight, especially with all the information coming around the pandemic, all those kinds of things, is to remind yourself to be really selective about what news sources you're using. That you really want to stick to reliable sources of information. At the end of this PowerPoint presentation, I've got a number of different resources I'll supply that I'll use to answer questions, to generate this webinar, those kinds of things. Sources that I trust to be fair and clear in the information that they're giving. We want to consider the practical value of the information, make sure that the information that we're gathering is applicable to our workplace and the challenges that we're facing. And along with the second one around the news sources, I want to caution you around if you're using news sources that use extravagant language and really exaggerating the situation and being the clickbait type stuff. Really be conscious of the information that you're accessing and how that can affect your mental health. One of the things I've tried to do and not been as successful at all at is setting boundaries on news consumption. I would say maybe like an hour a day. You kind of, okay, what's going on? What do I need to know? I just touched my face there, sorry. Around boundaries for your news consumption. It can be really easy to 16 hours a day have the news going and hearing all this information coming out. I don't think that's supportive of a mentally healthy practice. So one of the suggestions I always make is be cognizant of how much you're paying attention to what's going on, and being selective about how much information you're taking in. As I mentioned, there's some really good sources for information. The best source, in my opinion, and a lot of people's opinion, is the PSAC website. We have got a specific tab set up for the pandemic with all sorts of questions, scenarios around things like there's communications around telework. There's communications around what we're doing to support workers in this time. And there's all sorts of information around mental health issues that might be going on in the workplace, or that people might be feeling because of the constantly changing workplace. If you're looking for any sort of training or clear guidance on direction, the best website I can mention is ccohs.ca. That's the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety. All sorts of free information, posters, pamphlets, webinars. Really good source of information for the most up-to-date information on the pandemic. Absolutely fabulous organization for gathering health and safety information. Along with with that is the provincial health authorities. So each province has been amazing at providing up-to-date information on the current status of the pandemic, the current recommendations and directions from the different provinces. Make sure you're paying attention to your provincial health authorities and the direction and recommendations they're making, so that you can ensure that you're following them, you can ensure others are following them, and you can ensure the workplace is following them as well. And along with the provincial health authorities, Health Canada, that's my main source of information actually, is Health Canada on the current trends, recommendations, those kinds of things. Provincial health authorities will reference Health Canada and rely on the information from Health Canada as well when they make their provincial decisions as well. Also reference to provincial acts and regulations and the federal code. I didn't include the links there. Quick Google. You can find that information or contact your regional office and they can provide the links to that information as well. Also, a really good guide on the right to refuse process. It can be found at canada.ca and at the link there. It refers to the federal language around the right to refuse, but it's also really helpful for the provincial legislation as well there's a flow chart, there's walking through even in more detail the step-by-step process that even though it references the federal legislation, it refers to, you can use it and transfer it over to the provincial legislations as well, quite easily. Coming from the provincial jurisdiction as well myself, I'm used to all the time as being a PSAC activist, taking the federal language and then comparing how it applies to the provincial language. And if you need help with that process, we've got all sorts of resources around to help with that as well. So with that, you've got my email address there. You already would have had it if you got the call out information. Been having lots of people come forward with questions and concerns, those kinds of things. Absolutely fabulous to touch base and take the opportunity to touch base with people. At the end of the day, what I hope is by doing training sessions such as this, by the increased awareness around health and safety issues in the workplace, is that what I hope to see is a recommitment to health and safety as a priority in our workplaces, and as a consideration for workplace committees, those kinds of things. For myself especially, this pandemic has been a real eye-opener for some of the challenges, some of the lack of communication, and absolutely some of the lack of training. So I'm hoping when the dust has settled in all of this and the world starts to go back to normal, that we use this opportunity and learn from some of the challenges that we're facing in this period around health and safety, and use it to highlight why we need to take health and safety as a larger consideration, and put it back in the forefront. Because I've heard from a number of people that, oh, I work in an office, we don't really have health and safety concerns. Now we're seeing, through a pandemic such as this, that in fact there are all sorts of issues that do affect every single workplace that we represent. So just as a proviso before we get into some of the questions that you may have, and to be clear on my role in the region. So part of my role is I'm a PSAC staff person, and part of my roles and responsibilities around health and safety are to provide education, mobilization, information, guidance on the code and regulations or the provincial acts, those kinds of things. What I am not allowed to do and not able to do is dictate what locals and components do, how locals operate. I'm not able to meet with employer representatives and tell them what they should do. That's the responsibility of the locals and the components. They have the ability to enact workplace change. And obviously I can be a resource to locals and components along the way. I do that all the time, but just to be clear on my role, and respecting the PSAC structure, for those of you that play an active role within the leadership of PSAC, you know what I'm talking about, that locals get to decide how they operate. They don't need me as a regional representative telling locals what they should and shouldn't be doing. I might phrase it as, if when I was local president, I did this, best practices are this, I've seen other workplaces do this. I'll provide suggestions and guidance that way, but what I won't do is tell workplaces what they should do, tell locals what they should do, tell components what they should do. But it's a fine line that I have to walk. So as we go through with the question and answer period, I'm anticipating a lot of questions with specific workplace events. So just be mindful of